Australia, a land of golden beaches, impossible wildlife, and a postcard reputation that hides something far darker underneath. But what if the real story of this continent is soaked in blood, betrayal, and secrets so disturbing they were buried on purpose? Stick around for 101 nasty facts that will make your skin crawl. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. So settle in, keep the lights low, and let us begin. Fact number 1. Aboriginal Australians are the oldest continuous civilization on the face of the earth. Their culture stretches back at least 65,000 years, possibly even 75,000. To put that in perspective, when Aboriginal Australians were already singing songlines across the continent and trading between communities separated by hundreds of miles. But ancient Egypt did not yet exist. Rome was unimaginable. The pyramids were tens of thousands of years in the future. And yet, when British colonizers arrived in 1788, they declared the continent terra nullius, a Latin phrase meaning land belonging to no one, a legal fiction that erased 65,000 years of human history with two Latin words. When we say 65,000 years, it is worth sitting with that number for a moment. Modern Homo sapiens evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians made the crossing from what is now Southeast Asia at a time when sea levels were lower, and the journey, while still extraordinarily dangerous, was shorter than it would be today. They brought with them fire, language, art, and a complex understanding of the world. Over tens of thousands of years, they developed hundreds of distinct language groups, each as sophisticated and grammatically complex as any European language. They developed astronomical knowledge, tracking the movements of stars and using them for navigation, and for marking the seasons in ways that shaped when and where they hunted and gathered. They developed complex kinship systems that governed who could marry whom, how resources were shared, and how disputes were resolved. They developed a relationship with the land that was at once deeply spiritual and deeply practical, encoded in the songlines that mapped the continent in a network of story, song, and ceremony that connected communities across thousands of kilometers. When Terra Nullius erased all of this with two Latin words, it was not merely a legal fiction. It was an act of deliberate cultural annihilation. Fact number 2, the first British fleet to arrive in Australia in January of 1788 carried more than just settlers and supplies. It carried smallpox. Within months of the British landing at Sydney Cove, a catastrophic epidemic tore through Aboriginal communities. The disease spread with terrifying speed through populations that had no immunity whatsoever, and the death toll in the Sydney region alone was estimated to be somewhere between 50 and 90% of the local Eora people. Bodies were found decomposing in caves and along the harbour shores. The British colonisers, watching this unfold, often described it with a chilling detachment, as though the disappearance of the local population was simply a convenient development rather than a humanitarian catastrophe they had caused. The speed at which disease moved through Aboriginal communities in the months after the British landing gives some sense of what it would have been like to live through it. A community that had had no contact with the outside world for tens of thousands of years, had no immune response at all to diseases that Europeans had developed partial resistance to over centuries of repeated exposure. Smallpox was particularly devastating because it was highly contagious before symptoms appeared, meaning that infected people could spread the disease through an entire community before anyone knew they were sick. The survivors of the smallpox epidemic in the Sydney region were traumatized not just by their own illness, but by the experience of watching everyone around them die. They were burying family members, friends, elders, children, every person who held the knowledge and the ceremonies and the relationships that made their world function. The social fabric of communities was destroyed even where the physical bodies of individuals survived. Fact number 3. There is a genuine and deeply disturbing historical debate about whether that first smallpox outbreak was accidental or deliberate. The British fleet had brought vials of smallpox material with them, ostensibly for medical research. Some historians argue that the timing and the pattern of the epidemic suggest it was intentionally introduced. The debate has never been fully settled. What is certain is that the colonial authorities were aware that disease would devastate indigenous populations and did little to prevent the spread. In letters and journals from the period, some officials openly noted that the epidemic was making the colonization project significantly easier. Fact number 4. The Tasmanian genocide is one of the most documented cases of systematic ethnic cleansing in the modern era. When the British arrived in Van Diemen's Land, what is now called Tasmania, there were somewhere between 3,000 and 15,000 Aboriginal Tasmanians living across the island. By 1876, every single full descent Aboriginal Tasmanian was dead. A woman named Truganini, who died that year, was widely described as the last of her people, though this characterization was itself a colonial simplification. The mechanisms of this genocide included direct massacres, forced removal, introduced disease, starvation through land dispossession, and the deliberate destruction of family structures. It took less than 70 years to erase a population that had lived on that island for at least 40,000 years. The story of Truganini is one of the most haunting in Australian history. Truganini was a Nguannaway woman who was born around 1812 on Bruny Island, off the southeast coast of Van Diemen's Land. She watched her mother be stabbed to death by sailors when she was a child. Her fiancé was killed by timber cutters. She herself was sexually assaulted by workers who also drowned two of her companions. She became one of the Aboriginal guides who accompanied George Robinson on his expeditions across the island. And she understood that Robinson's promises of safety and land were the best available option, even if she did not entirely trust them. She lived out her life on Flinders Island, and later in Hobart, watching as the last of her people died around her. She died in 1876, at approximately 64 years of age. She had specifically asked to be buried at her home country, or at the bottom of the D'Entrecasteaux Channel, where the sea would carry her remains away. Instead, her skeleton was exhumed 2 years after her death and put on display at the Tasmanian Museum, where it remained until 1947. Her remains were finally cremated in 1976, 100 years after her death, and her ashes were scattered at sea. Fact number 5. In 1830, the governor of Van Diemen's Land, George Arthur, ordered what became known as the Black Line. He assembled more than 2,000 soldiers, convicts, and settlers in a human chain stretching across the settled parts of the island, and he attempted to physically drive all remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians into a peninsula where they could be contained. The Black Line marched for 7 weeks. It cost the colonial government roughly £30,000. It captured exactly 2 Aboriginal Tasmanians, an elderly man and a boy, but the psychological terror it spread through remaining communities was devastating, and the dispossession of land that followed the campaign made survival increasingly impossible. Fact number 6. George Robinson was a building contractor who styled himself as a humanitarian and a friend to Aboriginal Tasmanians. Between 1830 and 1834, he travelled the island with a group of Aboriginal guides and persuaded the remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians to surrender, promising them safety, land, and protection under British rule. He was lying. The survivors were relocated to Flinders Island, a windswept and inhospitable place in the Bass Strait, where they were housed in poorly built shelters, fed inadequate food, forced to wear European clothes in a cold climate they were not accustomed to, and subjected to religious indoctrination. Dozens died within the first years. Robinson was rewarded with a government posting to Victoria and was celebrated as a hero of humanitarian colonialism. Fact number 7. The Mile Creek Massacre of 1838 stands as one of the most documented atrocities on the Australian frontier. A group of 12 stockmen, both free settlers and convicts, attacked a group of approximately 30 Aboriginal Wurundjeri people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, at Mile Creek Station in New South Wales. The victims were bound together, led to a clearing, and killed with swords. The bodies were later burned to destroy evidence. What makes Mile Creek unusual is not the massacre itself, because dozens of similar events occurred across the frontier, but the fact that 7 of the perpetrators were eventually hanged for it. This was historically exceptional. The white colonial community was outraged not that the massacre had occurred, but that white men had been executed for killing Aboriginal people. Fact number 8. After the Mile Creek hangings, frontier violence against Aboriginal people continued but became more secretive. Perpetrators learned not to leave bodies where they could be found and to avoid writing things down. The result was a systematic undercounting of frontier deaths that has persisted in the historical record ever since. Modern historians, using a combination of oral history, newspaper archives, and station records, have concluded that frontier violence killed somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 Aboriginal people across Australia between 1788 and the early 20th century. The actual figure may be significantly higher. Fact number 9. The Pinjarra Massacre of 1834 was carried out by the governor of the Swan River colony himself, Sir James Stirling, who personally led a force of soldiers and settlers against a group of Bindjarab Noongar people on the banks of the Murray River in what is now Western Australia. The Noongar people were killed while trying to flee, including women and children who were shot as they attempted to cross the river. Stirling reported the dead at around 15, but contemporary Aboriginal accounts and later historical research suggest the figure was closer to 30. Stirling returned to Perth as a hero. Fact number 10. The Queensland Native Police Force operated from 1848 to 1904 and was one of the most effective instruments of colonial terror in Australian history. It was a paramilitary force of Aboriginal troopers drawn from communities far away from where they were deployed, so they had no personal ties to the people they were ordered to kill. Commanded by white officers, their primary function was to clear pastoral land of Aboriginal resistance. They operated under a euphemistic order that instructed them to disperse any gathering of Aboriginal people, a command that in practice almost always meant shooting people. Historian Jonathan Richards has estimated that the Queensland Native Police were responsible for somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 Aboriginal deaths. Their camps had no records, their operations had no official oversight, and their crimes were almost never prosecuted. Fact number 11. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the practice of chaining Aboriginal prisoners together at the neck while forcing them to walk long distances as part of their transport to prison was still occurring in the 1920s. Photographs exist. Government documents confirm it. Men, women, and sometimes children were connected by iron neck chains and made to walk hundreds of kilometers to distant prisons, often dying along the way from dehydration, infected wounds where the chains bit into their necks, or sheer exhaustion. When people died in transit, their bodies were sometimes left chained to the living prisoners until the group reached its destination. The neck chain, or coffle, was a standard piece of equipment for Aboriginal prisoner transport in many parts of the country from the 1880s onward. The chains were designed so that multiple prisoners could be linked together in a single file, each person's neck connected to the person in front and behind. The practical purpose was to prevent escape during the long overland journeys to remote prisons. The human cost was visible in the records that survive. Prisoners who were sick and could not keep up caused the entire group to stumble and fall, with the connecting chain dragging on the necks of those in front and behind. In summer heat that could exceed 45 degrees Celsius in the Kimberley, the iron chains heated to temperatures that burned the skin. The files of prisoners were often accompanied by a single police constable, sometimes two, which meant that any act of resistance risked a collective beating. The records of the Western Australian police from this period contain matter-of-fact references to prisoners dying in transit, their bodies described in the language of logistics rather than tragedy. Fact number 12. The stolen generations refers to the systematic policy of removing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families and communities, which was official government policy across multiple Australian states from roughly the 1910s through to the 1970s. Children were taken under various legal frameworks and placed with white families or in institutional care, with the explicit goal of breaking their connection to their culture, language, and identity. The language used in official documents was often openly eugenic. A.O. Neville, the chief protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, from 1915 to 1940, wrote openly about his plan to absorb Aboriginal people into the white population within 3 generations by controlling who could marry whom and by removing children from their mothers. He described this as a humanitarian project. Fact number 13. Children taken under the stolen generations policies were often told their parents were dead when they were not. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their languages. Many were placed in institutions where abuse, both physical and sexual, was endemic. When some attempted to return to their communities as adults, they sometimes found they no longer spoke the language and could not reconnect. They were between two worlds, not fully accepted in the white world and no longer fully connected to their own. The intergenerational trauma of this policy continues to affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities today, with documented effects on mental health, substance abuse, family violence, and rates of incarceration. Fact number 14. Aboriginal Australians were not counted in the national census until 1967. They were excluded from the section of the Australian Constitution that required the federal government to count all people living in Australia when distributing political representation. The 1967 referendum changed this, passing with over 90% of the vote. But what is less widely understood is what the vote actually changed and what it did not change. It gave the federal government the power to make laws for Aboriginal people, where previously only state governments had that power. It did not automatically grant citizenship, though most Aboriginal people had technically been Australian citizens since 1948. The referendum was an important symbolic and legal milestone, but it did not by itself fix the systems of disadvantage that had been constructed over nearly 2 centuries. Fact number 15. The Wave Hill Walk-Off of 1966 is one of the most significant labour actions in Australian history, and one that is rarely taught in schools. Aboriginal Gurindji stockmen on the Wave Hill cattle station in the Northern Territory, led by a man named Vincent Lingiari, walked off the job to protest their conditions. They were being paid a tiny fraction of what white workers received for the same work. They were often not paid in cash at all, but in food, tobacco, and clothing at inflated prices from the station store. They lived in separate camps away from white workers. They could be physically punished. The walk-off grew into a claim for land rights, and the Gurindji people occupied a place called Dagaragu, which they called their own. It took 9 years. But in 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam came to Dagaragu and poured a handful of red earth into Vincent Lingiari's palm, returning a portion of the land to the Gurindji people. The image became one of the most famous in Australian political history. Fact number 16. The first fleet to Australia carried 736 convicts. They had been transported from Britain as a solution to the catastrophic overcrowding of British prisons, which had themselves become so overcrowded that the British government had been housing convicts on rotting, decommissioned warships called hulks moored in the Thames and in other harbours. Life on the hulks was nightmarish. Disease was rampant, violence was constant. The hulks became so notorious that transportation to the other side of the world, to a continent that no European had ever tried to settle permanently, was considered preferable. The world from which the convicts of the First Fleet were taken was one of extraordinary brutality by modern standards, but extraordinary inequality even by the standards of its own time. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to displace agricultural workers in Britain and Ireland, driving people into overcrowded cities where there was not enough work and not enough food. The legal system that sent people to Australia for stealing a shirt or a loaf of bread was not aberrant for its time. It was the routine mechanism of a society that valued property more than human life, and that had no infrastructure for rehabilitating or housing those who fell outside the bounds of economic usefulness. The decision to use transportation to Australia as a solution to Britain's prison overcrowding crisis was driven almost entirely by pragmatic calculation rather than any concern for the welfare of the transportees. The First Fleet's commander, Captain Arthur Phillip, was sufficiently competent and humane to have some chance of making the experiment work. Phillip was unusual among the colonial administrators of his era, in that he had a genuine concern for the welfare of the convicts in his charge and a relatively respectful attitude toward the Aboriginal people he encountered. He forbade the shooting of Aboriginal people and was himself speared through the shoulder at Manly Cove in 1790, an event he responded to with remarkable equanimity. Fact number 17. The youngest convict transported to Australia on record was a boy named John Hudson, who was 9 years old when he was sentenced and transported. His crime was stealing a linen shirt and some stockings. He arrived in Australia in 1788 with the First Fleet. Another child convict, James Grace, was also transported as a young boy. The transportation records for the early colonial period contain many such cases. Children as young as 9, 10, and 11 years old sentenced to 7 or 14 years transportation for crimes that today would not result in criminal charges at all. Fact number 18. Norfolk Island, a tiny speck of land in the Pacific Ocean northeast of New South Wales, was used as a secondary penal colony for the worst offenders and the most difficult convicts. What happened there was, by almost any measure, a systematic program of torture. Flogging was routine, with sentences of 100, 200, or even 500 lashes handed down for minor infractions. Men were flogged until their backs were exposed to the bone. When a man fainted from the pain, he was given time to recover, and then the flogging was continued. The triangles, the wooden structures to which prisoners were tied for flogging, were permanently stained with blood. Commandant John Price, who ran the island in the 1840s, was so savage in his administration that he was eventually murdered by convicts in Melbourne years after he left the island, and a jury refused to convict any of the men responsible because they considered it justified. Norfolk Island as a secondary penal colony was designed from the beginning to be a place of punishment beyond what the main colony could provide. The island's isolation, more than 1,000 kilometres from the Australian mainland, made escape completely impossible. There was nowhere to go. The sea surrounding the island was rough and shark-infested, and there were no other inhabited islands within swimming distance. This isolation gave the commandants of Norfolk Island an extraordinary degree of unchecked power. When Major Joseph Anderson took command of the island in 1839, he found a population of convicts who were beyond desperation. Many begged to be hanged rather than continue living on the island. Anderson himself was appalled by what he found and instituted reforms that were later overturned by subsequent commandants. Accounts from convicts of the period describe scenes that read like something from a historical horror novel. Men flogged until they lost consciousness, revived and flogged again. Men kept in solitary confinement in underground cells for months at a time. Men who had gone completely insane, sitting in their own filth, muttering to themselves while guards walked past without acknowledging them. The island was finally closed as a penal settlement in 1855. Fact number 19. The treadmill was used in Australian convict prisons as a form of both punishment and power generation. Prisoners were forced to step on the paddles of a large wheel, which turned either to grind grain or simply as punishment with no productive purpose at all. The treadmill was deliberately designed to be exhausting and painful, with the paddles set at an awkward height so that the motion put maximum strain on the legs and back. Men worked on the treadmill in shifts, sometimes for hours at a time. Falls from the treadmill could result in serious injury. The sound of the wheel, a constant grinding, rhythmic noise, filled the yards of prisons across the colony. Fact number 20. Port Arthur in Van Diemen's Land was considered one of the most fearsome penal stations in the British Empire, and at its centre was a building called the Separate Prison, which was constructed in the 1840s based on a new theory of punishment. Instead of flogging, which was considered crude and increasingly controversial, the Separate Prison used total isolation. Each prisoner was kept in a completely individual cell. They were not allowed to speak to anyone. When moved around the prison, they wore hoods so they could not see other prisoners and were walked in complete silence. Chapel was held with individual cubicles so prisoners could hear the sermon but could not see each other. The philosophy behind the system held that isolation and silence would cause prisoners to reflect on their crimes and be reformed. In practice, it drove many of them insane. Medical records from Port Arthur document numerous cases of men who became catatonic, delusional, or violently disturbed after time in the Separate Prison. Fact number 21. Alexander Pearce was an Irish convict transported to Van Diemen's Land who escaped from Macquarie Harbour, a particularly brutal penal station on the island's wild west coast, twice. The first time he escaped with 7 other men. The environment was so hostile, the rainforest so impenetrable and the food so scarce that the group began to starve within days. They turned on each other. Pearce killed and ate his companions one by one as they made their way through the wilderness. He was the only one to emerge from the forest. When he was recaptured and confessed to what he had done, the authorities did not believe him. They thought he was covering for the others, who they assumed had simply escaped. He was sent back to Macquarie Harbour. He escaped a second time, this time with just one other man. When he was caught again, the other man was missing. In Pearce's coat pocket, the authorities found pieces of human flesh. He was hanged in 1824. The story of Alexander Pierce illuminates something important about the conditions at Macquarie Harbour. The harbour, on Tasmania's remote west coast, Key was accessible only by sea or by traversing some of the most impenetrable rainforest in the southern hemisphere. The forest west of the harbour, the area known as the Southwest Wilderness, is a landscape of extraordinary difficulty even with modern equipment. Without it, in the 1820s, it was nearly impassable. The men who escaped with Pierce were not naive about what they were facing. They were desperate enough that the prospect of starving in the wilderness or being eaten by their companions was preferable to continued existence in the harbour settlement. The conditions at Macquarie Harbour included not just physical punishment, but a kind of psychological torture that came from the total absence of any hope of improvement. Men were worked to exhaustion cutting hoo and pine, the prized timber of the harbour, and were given food that was systematically insufficient. The social breakdown that led to cannibalism among the escapees was not simply a failure of individual moral character. It was the predictable outcome of putting human beings in conditions of sufficient desperation. Pierce himself, after his second escape and recapture, seemed almost indifferent to the prospect of execution. He asked for a glass of rum and a piece of bread and went to the gallows without visible distress. Whatever had happened to him in the wilderness had removed his fear of death. Fact number 22. Women convicts in early colonial Australia were housed in what were called female factories, institutions that were supposed to provide work, housing, and discipline for convict women. The reality was often far grimmer. Women who were not assigned as domestic servants to free settlers were crowded into factories that were severely underfunded and understaffed. Disease was endemic, violence was common. Sexual abuse by guards and male convicts who worked in proximity to the women was documented and largely unpunished. Women who became pregnant were seen as having committed an infraction, and their children were often taken from them. The female factory at Cascades in Hobart held women in conditions so poor that a visiting official in the 1840s described them as worse than what he had seen in the prisons of Europe. The Cascades Female Factory, built in 1828, was the largest such institution in Van Diemen's Land and became notorious for conditions that were documented by visiting officials as being among the worst in the colonial penal system. The factory housed women in three categories: those assigned as domestic servants who were waiting for a new placement, those who were pregnant and could not be assigned, and those who had been sent there as punishment for various infractions. The punishment cells, which were dark, unheated, and in some cases partially underground, held women in conditions of complete isolation. The food was described repeatedly in official reports as insufficient and of poor quality. Disease moved through the crowded dormitories regularly. Women who gave birth in the factory often had their babies taken from them shortly afterward and placed in the orphan school, a separation that was understood to be a punishment for the fact of the pregnancy, and that many women described as the worst experience of their lives. Despite this, the Cascades Female Factory produced goods, primarily cloth and clothing, that were sold for the benefit of the colonial government. The labour of the women confined there was, in the most direct sense, profitable to those who confined them. Fact number 23. The assignment system, by which convicts were assigned as unpaid labour to free settlers, was in practice a system of slavery by another name. Assigned convicts had no right to refuse work, no right to choose their employer, no right to leave, and no legal protection against most forms of mistreatment short of outright murder. Settlers who worked their assigned convicts to exhaustion, beat them, underfed them, or sexually exploited them faced almost no consequences. Convicts who complained could be charged with insubordination and sentenced to additional punishment. Female convicts in particular were extremely vulnerable in the assignment system, with sexual exploitation by male employers being documented throughout the records of the period. Fact number 24. The last person to be publicly hanged in Australia was a man named William Tyrrell, who was executed in Melbourne in 1867. Public hangings in colonial Australia drew enormous crowds and were treated as entertainment. Vendors sold food and drink, parents brought children. People climbed trees and perched on rooftops for a better view. The body was sometimes left hanging for hours after death as a deterrent. One hanging in Sydney in the early colonial period drew a crowd estimated at nearly half the city's population. Fact number 25. Bushranger Ben Hall was never convicted of a crime. He was shot dead by police in 1865 in an ambush at Forbes in New South Wales. Hall was riddled with bullets, with reports at the time suggesting he was hit anywhere from 19 to 36 times. The police opened fire while he was asleep and continued firing long after he was clearly dead. A subsequent inquest found the killing to be justifiable. Hall was 27 years old. Whether he was the violent criminal the authorities portrayed him as, or a man driven to outlawry by the corrupt seizure of his property and false accusations, is still debated. Fact number 26. The conditions in which Chinese migrants on the Victorian goldfields lived and worked during the gold rush of the 1850s were deliberately made as hostile as possible by the colonial government. Chinese miners were subjected to a special tax called the Chinese Immigration Restriction Act, which charged them £10 per head, a sum equivalent to several months of wages, simply to land in Victoria. Many responded by landing in South Australia and walking overland to the Victorian goldfields, a journey of several hundred kilometres. at Buckland River in 1857, a mob of white miners attacked the Chinese camp, destroying property, burning tents, stealing gold, and driving the Chinese miners out of the area at gunpoint. Police arrived too late, or not at all, and no one was ever seriously prosecuted. The Lambing Flat riots of 1860 and 1861 in New South Wales were similar in character, with mobs of thousands of white miners attacking Chinese camps and burning everything to the ground. The treatment of Chinese miners was not simply a matter of mob violence, though the mob violence was real and severe. It was also embedded in colonial legislation that explicitly targeted Chinese people. The Victorian government's response to the Buckland River riots was not to protect Chinese miners from violence, but to introduce legislation making it more difficult for Chinese people to come to Victoria at all. The goldfields themselves had developed a culture in which European miners regarded the gold as inherently theirs, as a resource that belonged to European civilization and should be extracted by European hands. The Chinese miners, who were often more experienced in placer mining than their European counterparts and who were frequently able to work claims that Europeans had abandoned as played out, were seen not as fellow human beings seeking to improve their circumstances, but as an alien presence that violated the natural order of things. The violence at Lambing Flat in 1861, which involved thousands of men marching with a band playing and burning the Chinese camp to the ground, while many of the European miners were in a holiday mood, is difficult to understand without recognizing that the perpetrators did not see what they were doing as violence in any meaningful sense. They saw it as a reasonable assertion of racial priority. Fact number 27. The Eureka Stockade of 1854 is often romanticized in Australian culture as a founding moment of democracy. The reality is more complicated and considerably bloodier. The goldfields of Ballarat and Victoria were governed by an extremely corrupt licensing system. Miners were required to pay 30 shillings a month for a mining license, regardless of whether they found gold or not. The license hunts, in which police and soldiers descended on the diggings to check for licenses, were conducted with deliberate brutality. Miners were knocked to the ground, handcuffed to trees, and humiliated. In November of 1854, a group of miners built a stockade of wooden slabs and declared their defiance. In the early morning of December 3rd, soldiers and police stormed the stockade. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. 22 miners and 6 soldiers were killed. Around 114 miners were taken prisoner. Of those charged with treason, all were acquitted by Melbourne juries who refused to convict them. Fact number 28. The gold rush of the 1850s brought enormous wealth to Victoria, but the conditions on the goldfields were genuinely terrible. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera ripped through overcrowded diggings camps where there was no sanitation, no clean water, and no medical care. Men dug holes in the earth that frequently collapsed on them. Cave-ins were a constant hazard. Water in the deeper shafts drowned men who had no way of knowing the shaft below them had flooded. One estimate suggests that for every digger who made his fortune on the Victorian goldfields, dozens more spent everything they had, ruined their health, and returned home, if they returned at all, with nothing. Fact number 29. The Gundagai flood of 1852 was the deadliest flood in Australian history, and is remembered today primarily in the context of a famous Australian folk song about a dog sitting on a tucker box. The reality was devastating. The town of Gundagai had been built on the floodplain of the Murrumbidgee River, despite explicit warnings from local Wiradjuri Aboriginal people, who had lived along the river for thousands of years and understood its behaviour. A massive flood in June of 1852 swept through the town in the middle of the night and killed approximately 160 people, which was more than a third of the town's entire population. Bodies were never recovered. The devastation prompted one of the first major debates in Australian colonial history about whether Indigenous knowledge of the land should be taken seriously. Fact number 30. The Victorian gold rush created millionaires almost overnight, but it also created the conditions for some of the most spectacular and violent robberies in Australian history. The gold escort routes between the diggings and Melbourne were targeted repeatedly by bushrangers. One of the most audacious robberies occurred at Ballarat in 1854, when a gang of bushrangers held up the gold escort near Eureka and made off with an enormous sum. The guards were sometimes outnumbered and outgunned. The colonial government's response was to increase the savagery of the punishments for robbery, rather than to improve the conditions that drove men to rob. Fact number 31. Ned Kelly is perhaps the most famous Australian outlaw in history, and his story is complicated by the fact that it is genuinely unclear whether he was a murderer or a political rebel. The Kelly gang killed 3 police officers at Stringybark Creek in 1878, a fact that is not in dispute, but the context matters enormously. The Kelly family had been subjected to years of systematic harassment by the Victoria Police. Kelly's mother was imprisoned for allegedly assaulting a police officer in a situation that Kelly described as a setup. A constable named Alexander Fitzpatrick made a series of claims about the family that Kelly maintained were fabrications. The armour that Kelly and his gang wore in their final confrontation at Glenrowan, made from the mouldboards of ploughs, weighed approximately 44 kilograms each and was a genuine engineering achievement. Kelly was hanged at the Melbourne jail on November 11th, 1880. His last reported words were either, "Such is life," or, well, I suppose it has come to this. He was 25 years old. Fact number 32. The 1890s economic depression in Australia was catastrophic and is largely forgotten in popular history. The land boom of the 1880s had created a speculative bubble of extraordinary proportions in Melbourne in particular, where building societies and banks lent money with almost no scrutiny to anyone who wanted to build. When the bubble burst in 1891 and 1892, bank after bank collapsed. The Federal Bank, the Commercial Bank of Australia, the Building Society of Victoria, all of them failed. Tens of thousands of people lost their savings. Unemployment in some parts of the country reached 20% or higher. The Depression generated a wave of strikes and labour unrest that eventually contributed to the creation of the Australian Labor Party, but in the short term, it caused enormous suffering that fell hardest on the poorest workers. Fact number 33. The shearers' strikes of 1891 and 1894 were two of the most significant industrial conflicts in Australian history, and both ended in defeat for the workers. Pastoralists brought in non-union labour, called free labour or scab labour depending on who you asked, and the colonial governments deployed police and soldiers to protect the squatters' interests. In Queensland, the government arrested strike leaders and charged them with conspiracy. 7 strike leaders were convicted and sentenced to 3 years hard labour on St Helena Island in Moreton Bay. The sentences were later commuted. But the defeat of the shearers' strikes helped establish a pattern of government alignment with capital against labour that persisted in Australian industrial relations for many decades. Fact number 34. Australia federated in 1901, bringing the 6 colonies together as a single nation. One of the very first pieces of legislation passed by the new Commonwealth Parliament was the Immigration Restriction Act, which formed the legal foundation of what became known as the White Australia policy. The policy used a dictation test, which required potential migrants to pass a test in any European language chosen by the immigration officer as its primary mechanism of exclusion. The test was deliberately designed to be failed. An immigration officer could make a Chinese, Japanese, or Indian migrant take the test in Finnish or Polish or Welsh, languages the applicant had no chance of knowing. The dictation test was used to exclude not just Asian migrants, but also political undesirables of any background, including journalists, activists, and union organizers who were deemed potentially troublesome. Fact number 35. The White Australia policy was not just about immigration. It also drove a policy of forcible deportation of Pacific Islander workers, known as Kanakas, who had been brought to Australia to work on the Queensland sugar plantations. Thousands of these workers from places like Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, and other Pacific Island nations were forcibly deported between 1901 and 1908 under the Pacific Island Labourers Act. Many had lived in Australia for years, some had been born there. Many had wives and children in Australia who were left behind. The deportation separated families and destroyed communities, and the pastoral industry of northern Queensland, which had been built significantly on this labour, was forced to restructure under conditions that created further exploitation of Aboriginal workers. Fact number 36. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the Anzacs, landed at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915, and the battle that followed became one of the defining events of Australian national identity. What is less often discussed is the strategic incompetence that sent them there. The Gallipoli campaign was conceived by Winston Churchill as a way of knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war quickly by forcing a passage through the Dardanelles. The planning was inadequate, the intelligence was poor, the terrain was far more difficult than anyone had anticipated, and the Turkish defenders were far more resolute and capable than the British command had assumed. The Anzacs landed in the wrong place, in a cove hemmed in by steep ridges, and were immediately under fire. They never advanced more than a kilometre or so beyond their initial landing position. By the time the evacuation was completed in December of 1915, 8,700 Australians were dead and over 17,000 were wounded, all for a campaign that accomplished nothing. The mythology of Anzac has grown so large in Australia that it sometimes obscures the actual historical events. The landing at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915, was not the heroic assault on an entrenched enemy that it later became in national imagination. It was a confused, chaotic operation in which things went wrong from the very beginning. The Navy landed the troops in the wrong location, a mistake that placed them at the bottom of steep cliffs instead of the gently sloping terrain that the planners had anticipated. The commanders on the beach improvised as best they could, but the initiative that morning belonged to a Turkish officer named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, who recognized immediately what was happening and threw his division into the defense of the high ground with extraordinary urgency. By nightfall of the first day, the Anzacs held a beachhead of roughly 800 meters deep at its furthest extent. They would never advance significantly beyond that point. The 9 months that followed were a static campaign of trench warfare, artillery bombardment, disease, and attrition that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the decisive naval campaign through the Dardanelles that Churchill had envisaged. The evacuation in December of 1915 was, in purely military terms, the most successful part of the entire campaign. Fact number 37. The conscription debates of 1916 and 1917 were among the most bitter in Australian political history. Prime Minister Billy Hughes wanted to introduce conscription to maintain the flow of men to the Western Front, where Australian casualties were enormous. He put it to a referendum twice. Both times, the Australian people voted no. The campaigns on both sides were extraordinary in their viciousness. Anti-conscription campaigners, including members of Hughes's own Labour Party, were accused of cowardice, treachery and disloyalty. Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne, an Irish Catholic who opposed conscription on both religious and political grounds, was one of the most effective voices against it and was subjected to sustained vilification by the pro-conscription press. The first referendum was defeated by a margin of less than 1%. Hughes was expelled from the Labour Party, crossed the floor of Parliament, and formed a new government with the Conservatives. Fact number 38. The Battle of Fromelles in France on the night of July 19th and 20th, 1916, was the worst single night in Australian military history. In under 24 hours, Australian forces suffered almost 6,000 casualties in an attack that was conceived as a diversion to prevent German forces from being redeployed to the Battle of the Somme. The attack failed almost immediately. Soldiers who made it through the wire into the German trenches were cut off when the follow-up troops were stopped by artillery and machine gun fire. Many were killed in the German trenches. Others were wounded and lay in the no-man's land between the lines for days, unable to be retrieved. More than 400 Australians were buried in a mass grave by the Germans, a grave that was not discovered until 2008 when a local historian used archaeological techniques to locate it. Fact number 39. The Australian Imperial Force maintained a policy of not executing its own soldiers for cowardice or desertion during the First World War, unlike the British and many other Allied forces who shot soldiers for these offences. The British Army executed 306 soldiers during the war. The Australians executed none. This was due partly to a specific clause in the Australian Defence Act and partly to a different cultural attitude toward military discipline. But the policy did not mean Australian soldiers were not subject to brutal informal punishment. Shell shock, which we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, was largely unrecognised and untreated. Men who exhibited its symptoms were often described in official records as lacking moral fibre and were returned to the front line. Fact number 40. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 killed more Australians than the entire First World War. While approximately 60,000 Australians died in the war between 1914 and 1918, the influenza pandemic killed somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 people in Australia between 1918 and 1919. The death toll would likely have been higher, but Australia was one of the first countries to introduce a quarantine system for arriving ships. Even so, the disease eventually penetrated the country and spread with devastating speed. The pandemic hit Aboriginal communities particularly hard, with some remote communities losing a significant portion of their population. The pandemic ended with almost no public commemoration. The collective national trauma of two catastrophic events occurring in such close succession may help explain the bleakness that characterised much of Australian cultural life in the 1920s. Fact number 41. The Coniston Massacre in the Northern Territory in 1928 is considered the last officially documented large-scale massacre of Aboriginal Australians. Yeah, it was triggered by the killing of a dingo trapper named Fred Brooks, who had been living illegally on Walpurri and Anmatio country. A punitive expedition led by Police Constable William Murray killed at least 31 Aboriginal people over several weeks. Murray himself claimed the figure was low and boasted of the number of people he had shot. A government inquiry cleared him of any wrongdoing. The Territory Times newspaper, reporting on the inquiry, described the massacre as an unfortunate but perhaps necessary part of the process of settlement. Murray was awarded the King's Police Medal for Distinguished Service in 1933. Fact number 42. Donald Mackay was a businessman who organised 3 expeditions into the Central Australian desert in the 1930s to survey Aboriginal people and report on their condition to the government. What he found, and what he reported, was that there were still large numbers of Aboriginal people in the Central Desert who had never had contact with European Australians. His reports contributed to an acceleration of government policies designed to bring these communities under administrative control. The language used in government correspondence and policy documents of the period was consistently dehumanizing, describing Aboriginal people as a dying race and their cultural practices as superstitions and customs to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Fact number 43. On February 19th, 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin in the Northern Territory in the largest single attack ever carried out by a foreign power on Australian soil. 188 aircraft in 2 waves dropped bombs on the town and the harbour, killing at least 255 people and destroying or damaging 22 ships. The attack was larger than the attack on Pearl Harbor in terms of aircraft used and bombs dropped. The Australian government suppressed information about the attack for several days and then significantly underreported the casualties, claiming only 17 people had been killed. The real figure was not made public for decades. The suppression was motivated partly by fear of causing panic, and partly by a desire to avoid having to explain why Darwin's defences had been so completely inadequate. The aftermath of the February 1942 bombing of Darwin was marked not just by death and destruction, but by a remarkable social breakdown. Many of the civilian residents of Darwin fled south in what became known as the Adelaide River Stakes, a term coined by soldiers who watched civilians driving away in vehicles packed with possessions. The flight was condemned by military commanders as cowardly and undisciplined, but in retrospect, it is difficult to blame people who had just survived a massive air attack in a town with no anti-aircraft defenses to speak of, and no clear assurance that the Japanese would not simply land and occupy the town. Some of the looting that occurred in the days after the bombing was carried out by people who genuinely believed the town was about to be abandoned. The suppression of accurate information about the attack and its casualties was maintained by the Curtin government throughout the war. The official story was that the attack had been met with fierce resistance and had caused only minimal damage and casualties. The reality, which was that Darwin had been struck harder than Pearl Harbor and had been defended with almost complete inadequacy, was not made public until decades later. Fact number 44. The fall of Singapore in February of 1942 was described by Winston Churchill as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. More than 15,000 Australian soldiers were among the 100,000 Allied troops who surrendered to a Japanese force that was significantly smaller than the defending garrison. The subsequent treatment of Australian prisoners of war by the Japanese military was characterized by systematic violence, starvation, and forced labor. Approximately 22,000 Australians became prisoners of war in Asia during the Second World War. More than 8,000 of them died in captivity. Fact number 45. The Burma-Thailand Railway, known to its builders as the Death Railway, was constructed between 1942 and 1943 using Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers as forced labor. More than 13,000 Allied prisoners died during its construction from disease, starvation, overwork, and direct violence. Of those, more than 2,700 were Australians. The conditions were almost indescribably brutal. Cholera swept through the camps, killing men in hours. Men with tropical ulcers so severe that bone was exposed continued to be forced to work. Those who could not work were beaten. The Japanese guards' treatment of prisoners varied, with some relatively humane and others responsible for systematic torture and murder. The railway was completed in October 1943. The psychological damage to the men who survived was profound and lasted for the rest of their lives. Fact number 46. The Sandakan death marches of 1945 resulted in the deaths of all 2,428 Australian and British prisoners held at Sandakan camp in Borneo. As Allied forces advanced in the Pacific, the Japanese command ordered the evacuation of the camp on foot through the jungle to Ranau, a journey of more than 250 kilometers through mountainous terrain. Men who were already severely weakened by years of starvation and disease were forced to march. Those who could not keep up were shot or left to die. Only 6 men survived the marches, all of them Australians who had managed to escape into the jungle. Not a single man who remained in captivity survived. The Sandakan death marches are considered one of the worst atrocities committed against Australian soldiers in wartime. Fact number 47. The Cowra breakout of August 5, 1944, was the largest prison breakout in Australian history and resulted in the deaths of more than 200 Japanese prisoners of war. Over 1,000 Japanese prisoners at the Cowra prisoner of war camp in New South Wales armed themselves with makeshift weapons and rushed the camp perimeter in the early hours of the morning. They were motivated in part by the samurai code of Bushido, which held that capture was dishonorable and death preferable. The Australian guards opened fire with machine guns. By the time the prisoners who escaped had been recaptured, 231 Japanese prisoners were dead, and more than 100 were wounded. 4 Australian guards were also killed. The entire event was hushed up by Australian military authorities during the war. Fact number 48. The Brisbane Line was a proposed defensive strategy discussed by Australian military planners in 1942 as the Japanese advanced through the Pacific. The plan, which was never officially adopted but whose existence was widely rumoured and debated, that involved abandoning northern and western Australia to Japanese advance and concentrating defences along a line running roughly from Brisbane in the east to Adelaide in the south, defending only the most populous and economically productive parts of the country. The existence of the plan, when it leaked into public knowledge, caused enormous political controversy and outrage in Queensland and Western Australia, whose populations were presumably to be left to the mercy of Japanese occupation. The Curtin government denied the plan existed. Documents released decades later confirmed that it had been discussed. Fact number 49. Between 1952 and 1963, the British government conducted nuclear weapons tests on Australian soil with the full cooperation of the Australian government. The tests were carried out at Maralinga in South Australia and at Emu Field, and at the Montebello Islands off the coast of Western Australia. The Maralinga tests in particular caused severe and lasting contamination of a wide area of the South Australian desert. Aboriginal Australians, including members of the Maralinga Tjarutja people, were living in the area at the time. The Australian government was aware of this and took steps to move some communities, but these steps were inadequate and some people remained in or returned to the contaminated area. Many Aboriginal people from the region subsequently developed cancers and other illnesses that they attributed to radiation exposure. Australian soldiers who were present at the tests were not told of the risks and were often ordered to march through the contaminated areas shortly after detonations. The story of the British nuclear tests in Australia requires understanding the specific political context of the early 1950s. The British government was desperate to maintain its status as a major nuclear power in the face of the emerging Cold War, and it needed a test site that was remote enough to contain any accidents and politically controllable enough to prevent awkward questions being asked. Australia, with its vast uninhabited interior and its government of eager Cold War partners under Robert Menzies, was ideal. The Australian government was given some information about the tests, but not full information. And Menzies himself appeared to have little understanding of the long-term contamination issues that would result. The Aboriginal communities whose traditional lands were used for the test sites were given minimal consideration. A woman named Edie Milpuddy and her family were found to have camped at the Emu Field test site after a test had taken place there. They were decontaminated, but the long-term effects on them were never properly tracked. Declassified documents show that some officials were more concerned about the embarrassment that would result from Aboriginal people being found at test sites than with the health consequences for those individuals. Fact number 50. The Maralinga contamination was so severe that a cleanup operation was required decades later. Britain paid Australia £45 million for the cleanup, which was conducted in the 1990s. Subsequent reviews found that the cleanup was inadequate and that significant contamination remained. Plutonium, which has a half-life of 24,000 years, is still present at the site. The Maralinga Tjarutja people have been formally returned ownership of the land, but much of it remains effectively uninhabitable due to the contamination that Britain left behind and Australia permitted. Fact number 51. The Venona project and subsequent research revealed that the Soviet Union had successfully placed spies within the Australian government in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The most damaging of these was a diplomat named Ian Milner, who passed documents to Soviet intelligence. The discovery of Soviet penetration of the Australian government led to the creation of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, in 1949. ASIO's early years were characterized by a combination of genuine counterintelligence work and politically motivated surveillance of trade unionists, peace activists, academics, and anyone associated with the Labour Party's left wing. Fact number 52. The Petrov Affair of 1954 was one of the most extraordinary events in Australian Cold War history, and its timing was spectacularly convenient for the Conservative government of Robert Menzies. Vladimir Petrov was a Soviet diplomat and intelligence officer who defected to Australia in April of 1954, just weeks before a federal election. His defection was accompanied by a dramatic scene at the airport, where Soviet officials attempted to drag his wife onto a plane back to Moscow before she was taken off the aircraft by Australian officials. Menzies immediately called a royal commission into Soviet espionage in Australia. The commission and the drama around the defection dominated the election campaign, and Menzies won. Labour leader H.V. Evart, who handled the affair badly and made a series of erratic statements suggesting the whole thing was a political stunt, saw his party lose and his own mental health subsequently deteriorate. Fact number 53. Harold Holt was the Prime Minister of Australia, who disappeared in the ocean near Portsea in Victoria on December 17, 1967, and was never found. He was an experienced and enthusiastic swimmer who went into the sea at a beach called Cheviot Beach in rough conditions. He was seen to struggle in the waves and then vanished. No body was ever recovered. The disappearance gave rise to an enormous number of conspiracy theories, the most persistent being that he had been picked up by a Chinese submarine and defected to China. There is no credible evidence for this. The most plausible explanation is that he drowned and his body was carried out to sea by the current. He was eventually declared legally dead in 1967, but because no body was found, no inquest was held for decades. Australia's first inquest into Holt's death was not held until 2005. Fact number 54. The dismissal of Gough Whitlam's Labour government on November 11, 1975, remains the most constitutionally controversial event in Australian political history. Governor-General John Kerr dismissed the elected Prime Minister and appointed the opposition leader Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister, then immediately called a general election. Kerr had taken this action without consulting the Queen, without warning Whitlam that he was about to be dismissed, and without exhausting all other constitutional options for resolving the supply crisis that was the ostensible trigger for the dismissal. The role of the CIA in the events leading up to the dismissal has been a subject of controversy ever since. Christopher Boyce, a CIA employee who was later convicted of espionage, claimed that the CIA was actively working to remove Whitlam because of his attempts to close American intelligence facilities in Australia, particularly the Pine Gap facility. The matter has never been definitively resolved. Fact number 55. The 1978 Sydney Hilton Hotel bombing during the Commonwealth Heads of Government regional meeting killed 2 garbage collectors and a police officer. The bomber has never been definitively identified. The bombing led to the deployment of military forces in a domestic law enforcement context for the first time in Australian peacetime history, and it significantly boosted the resources and powers of Australian security agencies. One theory that has circulated for decades, supported by some former government insiders, is that the bombing was carried out by ASIO itself or by individuals connected to it as a way of boosting security funding and justifying greater surveillance powers. The theory has never been proven, but it has never been entirely disproved either. Fact number 56. The Lindy Chamberlain case is one of the most extraordinary miscarriages of justice in Australian legal history. In August of 1980, Lindy Chamberlain and her husband Michael were camping at Uluru, then called Ayers Rock, when their 9-week-old daughter Azaria disappeared from the family tent. Lindy reported that she had seen a dingo leaving the tent just before she discovered the baby was gone. She was not believed. The case became a media circus of extraordinary toxicity, with Lindy Chamberlain subjected to relentless public suspicion and ridicule. In 1982, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, while her husband received a suspended sentence as an accessory. She had been in jail for more than 3 years when a piece of Azaria's clothing was found near a dingo lair at Uluru in 1986. She was released and subsequently exonerated. In 2012, a 4th inquest finally returned a finding that Azaria had been taken by a dingo. The Azaria Chamberlain inquest process, which stretched over more than 30 years from 1980 to 2012, was a masterclass in the way that public prejudice and media narratives can distort the justice process. Expert witnesses who testified for the prosecution made claims that were subsequently shown to be based on flawed or fabricated scientific analysis. The claim that a chemical found in the family car was fetal blood, which was central to the prosecution case, turned out to be a false positive result. The forensic scientist who identified it had used a test that was not appropriate for the material being analyzed, and had interpreted the results incorrectly. Lindy Chamberlain spent 3.5 years in jail for a crime that did not happen. Fact number 57. Ivan Miller was an Australian serial killer who murdered at least 7 backpackers in the Belanglo State Forest in New South Wales between 1989 and 1992. The victims, who came from Australia, Germany, and the United Kingdom, were targeted while hitchhiking and were subjected to extreme violence. Miller was convicted in 1996 and sentenced to 7 life terms. He died in prison of cancer in 2019. What made the case particularly disturbing beyond the murders themselves was the revelation of how long it had taken for the pattern to be recognized, and how the victims' families in some cases spent years not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. Millart's nephew, Matthew Millart, was convicted in 2012 of murdering a teenager in the same forest with a machete in a case that echoed his uncle's crimes. Fact number 58. The Port Arthur massacre of April 28th and 29th, 1996 is the deadliest mass shooting in Australian history. Martin Bryant, a 28-year-old man from Hobart, opened fire in the historic Port Arthur site and in surrounding areas, killing 35 people and wounding 23 others. Bryant had no known political motive. He was subsequently diagnosed with a severe intellectual disability and a lifelong history of violent and disturbing behavior that had been either ignored or inadequately addressed by services that had encountered him over many years. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 35 life terms with no possibility of parole. The massacre prompted the Howard government to push through sweeping gun control legislation within 12 days of the shooting, a legislative achievement that remains extraordinary for its speed and its political courage. Australia has not had a mass shooting of comparable scale since. The speed and decisiveness with which Prime Minister John Howard's government responded to the Port Arthur massacre with gun law reform deserves recognition as an unusual moment of political courage in democratic governance. Howard implemented the reforms knowing that they would cost him support among rural and conservative voters, key constituencies for his recently elected coalition government. He wore a bulletproof vest when addressing a public meeting in regional Victoria, where the crowd was hostile. He pushed through a buyback scheme that collected more than 650,000 firearms from Australian citizens. The political cost was real. His government lost a number of rural seats in subsequent elections. But the policy outcome was dramatic. Australia has not experienced a mass shooting comparable to Port Arthur in the nearly 30 years since the legislation was passed. International public health researchers have studied the Australian gun buyback as one of the most significant natural experiments in the relationship between gun availability and gun violence. And the evidence consistently suggests that the reforms have had a significant effect on the rate of firearm homicide and suicide in Australia. Fact number 59. The Childers Palace backpacker hostel fire of June 2000 killed 15 young travelers from various countries, including Australia, Japan, South Korea, and several European nations. The fire was deliberately lit by a drifter named Robert Long, who had a long-standing grievance against the hostel's management. The fire spread quickly through a building that had inadequate fire exits, no sprinkler system, and windows that were either locked or difficult to open. People were trapped on upper floors. Some jumped from windows to escape the flames. Long was convicted of 15 counts of murder in 2001 and sentenced to life imprisonment. The fire prompted a national review of fire safety standards in budget accommodation, which found that the Childers Hostel was far from unique in its deficiencies. Fact number 60. The 2002 Bali bombings killed 88 Australians, more citizens of any country other than Indonesia, in a nightclub district in Kuta. The bombings, carried out by the Jemaah Islamiyah network, targeted an area popular with young Australian tourists and struck on a Saturday night when the venues were packed. The devastation was catastrophic. Many of the Australian victims were from close-knit country communities, particularly in Victoria, which created a grief that radiated through small towns and regional communities across the country. The bombings fundamentally changed Australian perceptions of terrorism and accelerated Australia's involvement in anti-terrorism operations in Southeast Asia. Fact number 61. Cyclone Tracy struck Darwin on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1974 and destroyed approximately 70% of the city's buildings. 49 people on land and 16 at sea were killed. More than 25,000 of the city's 47,000 residents were evacuated after the cyclone, many of them traumatized and with no possessions. It was the largest peacetime evacuation in Australian history. The sound of the cyclone was described by survivors as unlike anything else on Earth, a shrieking, howling, relentless assault that went on for hours in complete darkness. Many people spent the night in bathtubs, under mattresses, and in interior rooms, listening to their houses tear apart around them. Fact number 62. The 2009 Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria were the deadliest fires in Australian history, killing 173 people on February 7, 2009, and destroying more than 2,000 homes. The fires occurred on a day of unprecedented heat and wind, with temperatures exceeding 46 degrees Celsius in some areas. Some fires were started by arsonists, others by failed power infrastructure, and others by lightning. The speed at which the fires moved overwhelmed the ability of emergency services to respond, and left residents with no time to evacuate. Entire communities, including Kinglake Marysville and Strathewen, were almost completely destroyed. The subsequent Royal Commission found that the policy of staying and defending homes against approaching bushfire, which had been official government advice for decades, needed to be substantially revised. The Black Saturday fires challenged assumptions embedded in Australian bushfire management for decades. The stay or go policy, which advised householders that they should either leave early before a fire approached or stay and actively defend their homes, had been developed in response to the observation that many people died in fires while trying to flee at the last minute. This logic held in most fire situations. On Black Saturday, it was overwhelmed by conditions that were genuinely unprecedented in the historical record. The combination of extreme heat, extreme wind, and extraordinarily dry fuel created fires that moved at speeds and generated temperatures that no house could withstand and no human could survive outside. People who stayed to defend their homes often had no time to implement any defense at all. The firefront arrived and the house was gone before they could act. The Royal Commission that followed the fires recommended shifting the official advice to emphasize leaving early before fire threatens as the default safe option, a change that represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between Australians and the fire-adapted landscape they inhabit. Fact number 63. The rabbit-proof fence that stretches across Western Australia was constructed between 1901 and 1907 to prevent rabbits from spreading from the east of the state into the agricultural southwest. It is one of the longest fences in the world, stretching for more than 3,000 kilometres. It ultimately failed to stop the rabbits. But the fence's historical significance in Australian culture comes primarily from its role in the story of three Aboriginal girls, Molly Craig, Daisy Caddible, and Gracie Fields, who escaped from the Moore River Native Settlement in 1931 and walked nearly 2,000 kilometres home along the fence. The girls had been removed from their families under the Stolen Generations policy. Their story, told by Molly Craig's daughter Doris Pilkington Garamara in a book and later adapted into a film, became one of the most powerful accounts of the Stolen Generations' impact. The story of Molly Craig and her sisters walking nearly 2,000 kilometres along the rabbit-proof fence rewards careful attention to detail. Molly was 14 when she walked, her sister Daisy was 8, their cousin Gracie, who was 10, was persuaded by a member of the settlement staff that her mother was in a different location and left the group mid-journey only to be recaptured. Molly and Daisy walked for 9 weeks. They travelled through desert country, avoiding roads and settlements where they might be seen and reported. They survived by eating what they could find in the bush. They were tracked by one of Australia's most experienced trackers, a Mardu man named Mudu, who was employed by the settlement. He tracked them all the way to Jigalong and reported back that they had arrived home. In the bureaucratic records of the period, this is recorded as a failed pursuit. Molly and Daisy lived out their lives at Jigalong. Molly's daughters were later removed under the same policies that had taken her from her mother. The cycle of removal had been designed so that Molly's walk would eventually come to seem futile. Fact number 64. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, which reported in 1991 after a 4-year investigation, examined 99 deaths of Aboriginal people in prison or police custody in Australia. Its findings were devastating. It found that Aboriginal people were not dying at a higher rate in custody than non-Aboriginal people, but they were being imprisoned at massively disproportionate rates. The root causes identified by the Commission included the entire history of colonisation, land dispossession, the destruction of culture and family, the stolen generations, poverty, inadequate housing, unemployment, and the lack of access to services. The Commission made 339 recommendations. Yet a 2020 review found that most had not been fully implemented. In the 30 years since the Royal Commission reported, more than 400 Aboriginal people have died in Australian custody. Fact number 65. The Hindmarsh Island Bridge affair in the 1990s was a legal and political controversy about sacred Aboriginal women's business and the construction of a bridge on the Kulin coast of South Australia. The Ngarrindjeri women's opposition to the bridge construction on the grounds that it would disturb sacred sites was dismissed by a Royal Commission as a fabrication, a finding that was subsequently overturned by the Federal Court. The affair exposed deep fissures in Australian society around the credibility afforded to Aboriginal cultural claims, and became a flashpoint in the broader political battle over native title that followed the Mabo decision of 1992. Fact number 66. The Mabo decision of 1992, in which the High Court of Australia recognised Eddie Mabo's claim to land in the Murray Islands and overturned the legal fiction of terra nullius, was one of the most significant legal decisions in Australian history. The decision was greeted with fury in parts of the pastoral and mining industries, which feared it would give Aboriginal Australians the ability to claim vast tracts of land. Prime Minister Paul Keating described the implications as an opportunity for reconciliation and justice. The subsequent Native Title Act of 1993 attempted to balance the rights of Aboriginal Australians with the interests of existing landholders, and the subsequent decades saw a series of legal battles about the extent and nature of native title claims that is still being worked through the courts today. The Mabo decision was handed down by a high court that had spent years deliberating on the question of whether Aboriginal Australians had any legal rights to land that predated the Crown's assertion of sovereignty. The plaintiffs in the case, led by Eddie Koiki Mabo, a Torres Strait Islander man from Murray Island, had begun their legal action in 1982. Mabo himself died of cancer in January 1992, 5 months before the decision was handed down. He never knew he had won. The decision's recognition of native title was an act of significant judicial courage in a country where the courts had historically been willing to accept the legal fictions of colonialism at face value. The subsequent backlash was fierce. Some newspapers published cartoons and commentary that would today be considered overtly racist. The pastoral industry lobbied aggressively against the extension of native title rights to pastoral leasehold land. The mining industry raised fears about the security of mining titles. Fact number 67. Australia has some of the highest rates of skin cancer in the world. A grim legacy of decades of cultural celebration of outdoor life and sun exposure, combined with a hole in the ozone layer over the southern hemisphere, that dramatically increased ultraviolet radiation levels in Australia compared to most other parts of the world. The ozone hole was caused primarily by chlorofluorocarbons released by refrigeration and aerosol products manufactured primarily in the northern hemisphere. Australia and New Zealand, which contributed relatively little to the problem, bore a disproportionate share of its consequences. 2 in 3 Australians will be diagnosed with skin cancer by the age of 70. The Slip Slop Slap campaign, launched in the 1980s, has been one of the more successful public health campaigns in the country's history, but the incidence of melanoma remains among the highest in the world. In fact number 68, the Franklin River Dam controversy of the early 1980s was a watershed moment in Australian environmental politics. The Tasmanian state government proposed to dam the Franklin River in the southwest wilderness of Tasmania to provide hydroelectric power. The wilderness area was one of the most intact temperate rainforest ecosystems in the southern hemisphere, home to species found nowhere else on Earth, and containing archaeological sites that pushed the history of human habitation in Tasmania back far beyond what had previously been known. Bob Brown, a doctor who later became a senator and the leader of the Australian Greens, was arrested and briefly jailed for protesting against the dam. The campaign generated enormous public opposition across Australia. The election of the Hawke Labor government in 1983 brought a federal government committed to stopping the dam, and the area was subsequently listed as a World Heritage Site. The dam was never built. Fact number 69. Australia's relationship with immigration detention has been one of the most internationally criticised aspects of its recent policy history. The policy of mandatory detention for asylum seekers who arrive by boat, which was introduced in 1992 and significantly expanded in the 2000s under both Labor and coalition governments, has resulted in thousands of people, including children, being held in detention centres for years at a time while their claims are assessed. The detention centres, particularly those on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea and on Nauru, were the subject of extensive reports of abuse, medical neglect, mental health crises, sexual assault, and self-harm. The United Nations and numerous human rights organisations describe conditions as amounting to torture. Successive Australian governments defended the policy as a necessary deterrent to people smuggling. Fact number 70. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which ran from 2013 to 2017, heard evidence of sexual abuse of children on a scale that shocked Australia. The Commission received accounts from more than 15,000 survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. It found that the abuse had occurred in religious institutions, schools, orphanages, sporting clubs, and family group homes across the country over many decades. The Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Salvation Army, that and numerous other institutions were found to have enabled abusers by moving them between locations rather than reporting them to police, pressuring victims to remain silent, and prioritizing the reputation of the institution over the welfare of children. Cardinal George Pell, who was the Vatican's treasurer and the third most senior figure in the Catholic Church, was convicted of historical child sex offences in 2018, though the conviction was subsequently overturned by the High Court on appeal in 2020 in a decision that was deeply controversial. Fact number 71. Australia has one of the highest rates of incarceration of Indigenous people in the world. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up approximately 3% of the general population, but approximately 29% of the adult prison population. In some states, the proportion is even higher. For Aboriginal women and young people, the rates of incarceration have been increasing rather than decreasing over the past 2 decades, despite the recommendations of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. The Northern Territory's mandatory sentencing laws, which were in place for various periods in the 1990s and 2000s, and which removed judges' discretion in sentencing for certain property offences, had a disproportionate impact on Aboriginal people and were widely criticised by legal authorities and human rights organisations. Fact number 72. The Rudd government's formal apology to the stolen generations, delivered in Parliament on February 13, 2008, was one of the most emotionally significant moments in recent Australian political history. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd used the words, "We apologise for the policies of successive governments that had resulted in the forcible removal of Aboriginal children from their families." The apology was watched by hundreds of thousands of people across the country and was greeted with an outpouring of emotion. The previous coalition government under John Howard had repeatedly refused to issue a formal apology on the grounds that the current generation should not be held responsible for the actions of previous generations. Howard's refusal was a significant ongoing source of political tension and had been identified by many Aboriginal leaders as a major obstacle to reconciliation. Fact number 73. Australia has the worst rate of mammal extinction of any country in the world. Since European colonisation, at least 34 native mammal species have become extinct, and many more are critically endangered. The causes include habitat destruction, the introduction of foxes and cats as apex predators, for which Australian fauna had no evolutionary defences, and the impacts of agricultural practices on the landscape. The northern quoll, the bilby, the numbat, the greater bilby, the Tasmanian devil on the mainland, all of them have suffered catastrophic population declines. The feral cat is estimated to kill somewhere between 1 and 6 billion animals per year in Australia, a figure that is almost impossible to comprehend. The scale of Australia's feral cat problem is genuinely difficult to comprehend in the abstract. But feral cats were introduced with the first European settlers and have spread to cover virtually every part of the Australian continent, including the most remote desert areas where they had not been expected to survive. Studies using GPS tracking devices have found that individual feral cats can range over territories of several hundred square kilometres. They are extraordinarily efficient hunters, capable of catching dozens of animals in a single night. The animals they kill have evolved over tens of millions of years in an environment with no comparable predators. They have almost no defensive behaviours against cats. A bilby or a bandicoot that encounters a feral cat for the first time often does not recognize it as a threat until it is too late. Conservation efforts that have had some success in protecting endangered native mammals from cats involve building large feral-proof fencing to create predator-free areas. The fences cost millions of dollars per kilometre. Australia's mainland is approximately 7.5 million square kilometres. The mathematics of feral cat control at a continental scale are daunting to the point of discouragement. Fact number 74. The cane toad is perhaps the most infamous example of a biological intervention that went catastrophically wrong. In 1935, 101 cane toads were imported to Queensland from Hawaii to control the cane beetle, which was damaging sugarcane crops. The toads failed almost completely to control the beetle, which lives in the soil while the toads hunt on the surface. But the toads themselves proved extraordinarily successful at breeding and spreading across the northern part of the continent. There are now estimated to be more than 2 billion cane toads in Australia. They are toxic to native predators that attempt to eat them, and their spread has been linked to significant population declines in numerous native species, including freshwater crocodiles, quolls, and goannas. Controlling or eradicating the cane toad has proven effectively impossible. Fact number 75. The Great Barrier Reef has lost more than half of its coral cover since 1985 and has experienced 5 mass bleaching events since 1998, each caused by unusually warm ocean temperatures associated with climate change and El Nino events. The most severe bleaching events in 2016 and 2017 killed large portions of the northern reef, which had previously been the least disturbed section. The reef is the world's largest coral system and is a UNESCO World Heritage Area. It supports around 64,000 jobs and contributes approximately $6.4 billion per year to the Australian economy. Australian climate scientists have repeatedly warned that the rate of emissions reduction globally is insufficient to prevent the permanent degradation of the reef. The Australian government has faced international criticism for its relatively slow movement on emissions reduction compared to many other developed nations. Fact number 76. Australia has been described as the fire continent, and its relationship with fire is fundamental to understanding its ecology and its history. Aboriginal Australians used fire as a land management tool for tens of thousands of years, a practice known as cultural burning or fire stick farming, which maintained the landscape in a relatively open and fire-resistant condition. European settlers systematically suppressed burning, misunderstanding it as destructive rather than recognizing it as management. The buildup of fuel loads over more than 2 centuries has contributed to conditions in which catastrophic bushfires are increasingly possible. The summer of 2019 and 2020, known as the Black Summer, saw fires of unprecedented scale burn through approximately 18 million hectares across southeastern Australia, killing at least 33 people directly and an estimated 3 billion animals. The practice of cultural burning. The deliberate use of fire to manage the landscape that Aboriginal Australians had developed over tens of thousands of years was a sophisticated land management system that maintained the continent in a state that was genuinely productive and relatively fire-safe by the standards of the pre-colonial period. Aboriginal burning was not indiscriminate. It was timed to specific seasons, specific weather conditions, and specific ecological purposes. Different types of country were burned on different schedules. The goal was not to burn everything, but to create a mosaic of burnt and unburnt areas that produced habitat for the animals and plants that were important for food and ceremony, that reduced the accumulation of fuel, and that created fire breaks that limited the spread of uncontrolled fires. The European settlers who arrived and saw this burning from a distance often described it as wasteful and destructive. They did not understand what they were seeing. Within a generation or two, the cessation of Aboriginal burning had transformed significant parts of the Australian landscape, allowing fuel loads to build to levels that made the fires that eventually occurred far more catastrophic than anything Aboriginal burning had produced. Fact number 77. The Murray-Darling Basin, which drains roughly 1/7 of the Australian continent and provides water to Australia's most productive agricultural regions, has been the subject of one of the most bitterly contested environmental and political battles in Australian history. Decades of over-allocation of water rights to agricultural irrigators, combined with the effects of drought and climate change, have brought the river system to the verge of ecological collapse in many places. Mass fish kills, including the deaths of millions of fish in the Darling River near Menindee in 2018 and 2019, shocked the nation. A plan to return enough water to the system to sustain it ecologically, while still supporting agricultural use, has been disputed by farming communities, state governments, and federal politicians for more than a decade. Meanwhile, investigations have raised allegations that some water license holders have been illegally or improperly extracting large quantities of water from the system, while small farmers downstream have watched their allocations shrink. Fact number 78. The Phar Lap mystery has intrigued Australians for nearly 90 years. Phar Lap was the greatest racehorse in Australian history, and possibly one of the greatest in the world. He won 37 of his 51 races, including the 1930 Melbourne Cup. In 1932, he was taken to America to race and won the Agua Caliente Handicap in Tijuana in a time that broke the track record. 2 weeks later, he was dead, apparently of poisoning. Whether he was deliberately poisoned and by whom has never been established. American bookmakers and gamblers who had lost significant money on races he was expected to run were the most obvious suspects. Australians largely assumed that Americans had killed their horse. The Americans largely denied it. Phar Lap's heart, preserved at the Melbourne Museum, weighs 6.4 kilograms, roughly twice the size of an average racehorse's heart, which may partly explain his extraordinary stamina. Fact number 79. Australia had a Prime Minister who was an Olympic gold medalist. Harold Holt, the Prime Minister who later disappeared in the ocean, won gold in the 100 yards backstroke at the British Empire Games in 1938. Australia has also had a Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, who held the world record for drinking a yard of ale at Oxford University, consuming it in 11 seconds. Hawke described this achievement in his autobiography as the most significant contribution to Australia's foreign relations that he ever made. Fact number 80. The Nullarbor Plain in South Australia and Western Australia, the largest limestone plateau in the world, contains a cave system called Cocklebiddy Cave that extends for more than 6 kilometers into the earth and is almost entirely underwater. It is one of the longest underwater cave systems in the world and has been the site of several diving expeditions, some of them fatal. The plain itself, stretching for more than 1,000 kilometers, takes its name from Latin words meaning no trees, and it is a landscape of extraordinary barrenness and beauty that gives some sense of the scale and harshness of the Australian interior. Fact number 81. Australia once waged a military campaign against emus and lost comprehensively. The Great Emu War of 1932 was a wildlife management operation conducted by the Australian military using machine guns in the Campion district of Western Australia. Approximately 20,000 emus had gathered in the area, damaging crops and fencing. 2 Lewis guns were deployed along with soldiers under the command of Major GPW Meredith. The emus proved extremely difficult to kill. They scattered when fired upon, refused to bunch up in ways that would allow the machine guns to be effective, and proved resistant to being stopped even when hit multiple times. After several days of operation, the military had killed fewer than 300 birds. The operation was abandoned, resumed, and abandoned again. The comic absurdity of the Great Emu War tends to obscure its context, which is actually quite sad. The farmers of the Campion district in Western Australia in 1932 were not in a good situation. They were soldier settlers, who were men who had been given land by the government after the First World War as part of a scheme to reward their service. The land they were given was marginal wheat country in a part of the state that received irregular rainfall. The early 1930s coincided with both the global Great Depression, which collapsed wheat prices, and a period of drought that reduced yields. The farmer settlers were struggling financially in ways that made the arrival of 20,000 emus eating their crops an existential threat rather than a nuisance. The involvement of the military was not a joke to them. It was a desperate measure taken by men who were already close to the edge of financial ruin. When the military's intervention failed and the emus continued to eat their crops, the farmers were left to deal with the problem on their own, to using bounties on emu beaks rather than machine guns, and eventually bringing the emu population under some control through sustained organized shooting. Fact number 82. The Lost Children of Daylesford case of 1867 was one of the most traumatic events in the early history of Victoria. 3 children, 9-year-old Isaac Duff, 7-year-old Jane Duff, and 3-year-old Frank Duff wandered away from their family's property near Daylesford and were lost in the bush for 9 days. The search for the children involved hundreds of volunteers and became a national story. The children survived partly because local Aboriginal men tracked them through the bush and kept them alive, a fact that was somewhat underemphasized in the original newspaper accounts, which focused on the narrative of European settlers searching the wilderness. The children's survival was attributed to their keeping each other warm by sleeping together and to water found at creek beds. Fact number 83. Australia's most bizarre constitutional crisis occurred in 2017 and 2018, when it was discovered that many members of the Australian Parliament were technically dual citizens of other countries, and therefore ineligible to sit in Parliament under Section 44 of the Australian Constitution. The cascade of revelations forced the resignation or disqualification of numerous politicians, including the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who was discovered to be a New Zealand citizen through his father. The Constitution, written in 1901, had been designed for a very different era and contained provisions that were simply not compatible with the reality of modern citizenship in a country built on immigration. The crisis eventually consumed significant political energy over several months. Fact number 84. The Wanda Beach murders of January 11th, 1965, in which 2 teenage girls, Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt, were raped and murdered at Cronulla in Sydney, remain the longest unsolved murders in New South Wales history. Despite thousands of hours of police work over more than 50 years, numerous persons of interest investigated, and a coronial inquest that took place decades after the event, no one has ever been charged with the murders. The case has generated multiple theories and has attracted the attention of investigators and amateur sleuths for decades. The victims were 15 years old. Fact number 85. The Beaumont children, Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont, aged 9, 7, and 4, disappeared from Glenelg Beach in Adelaide on Australia Day, January 26, 1966. They went to the beach in the morning and were never seen again. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in South Australian history and generated multiple theories about what had happened to them. No bodies were ever found, no one has ever been charged. The disappearance shattered the relatively trusting community culture of suburban Australia and is often cited as a moment after which Australian society became fundamentally more cautious about children's safety. The disappearance of Jane, Anna, and Grant Beaumont is often described as the day Australia lost its innocence. In the Adelaide of 1966, children of 9, 7, and 4 years old routinely travelled independently in public spaces. They caught buses alone, they went to the beach alone, they walked to the shops alone. This was simply how childhood worked in suburban Australia. The idea that a child could be taken by a stranger in a public place in broad daylight and never seen again was not something that the social and parental culture of the time had developed adequate defences against. The Beaumont case did not simply prompt individual parents to keep closer watch on their children. It changed the entire cultural framework within which Australian childhood occurred. The free-range childhood of the pre-Beaumont era in Australia effectively ended. Numerous individuals over the decades have claimed to know what happened to the children, and several have described in detail how they believe the children were killed and where their bodies might be found. Large-scale excavations have been carried out at various sites based on these claims. None has found any trace of the children. Fact number 86. Australia has produced some of the most audacious financial frauds in the common law world. Christopher Skase, a media and tourism entrepreneur who built an empire in the 1980s on borrowed money, fled to Mallorca in Spain when his companies collapsed with debts of more than $1 billion. He lived in Mallorca for more than a decade, contesting extradition on the grounds of ill health, appearing in photographs pushing a wheelchair while others claimed he was well enough to live comfortably. He died in Spain in 2001 without ever returning to face Australian justice. Alan Bond, who won the America's Cup for Australia in 1983 in one of the most celebrated sporting achievements in the country's history, was subsequently convicted of Australia's largest corporate fraud, involving approximately $1 billion. He served less than 4 years in prison. Fact number 87. The Granville train disaster of January 18, 1977, was the worst rail disaster in Australian history. A commuter train from Mount Victoria to Sydney derailed and struck the supports of a road bridge over the railway line near Granville in Western Sydney. The bridge collapsed onto the carriages. 83 people were killed and more than 210 were injured. Emergency workers described scenes of extraordinary horror as they worked to free the living and the dead from the crushed carriages underneath the concrete of the collapsed bridge. The investigation found that the derailment was caused by a track fault. The accident led to significant improvements in rail safety standards and in the design of bridges over railway lines. Fact number 88. The Thredbo landslide disaster of July 30th, 1997, buried 2 ski resort lodges in the snowy mountains of New South Wales under a torrent of earth and rock. 18 people died. 1 person survived, a ski instructor named Stuart Diver, who was found alive by rescuers 65 hours after the landslide, while trapped in a concrete void with his wife, who had died beside him. His survival was considered extraordinary. Diver became a symbol of resilience in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. The investigation found that the landslide had been triggered by a water main leak that had gradually destabilized the slope, and that the infrastructure beneath the resort had been inadequately maintained. Fact number 89. The Royal National Park south of Sydney, established in 1879 as the second national park in the world after Yellowstone, has burned in catastrophic fires repeatedly over its history. Each time, the popular and political response has alternated between demands for more aggressive fire suppression and demands for more strategic burning. The underlying tension between European settler attitudes toward fire, which see it primarily as a destructive force to be suppressed, and the Indigenous understanding of fire as a management tool, has never been fully resolved in Australian land management policy. The Ku-ring-gai chase and surrounding park fires of the early 20th century set a pattern of response that persisted, with consequences, for the rest of the century. Fact number 90. The gap in health outcomes between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and the non-Indigenous population remains one of the starkest measures of inequality in the country. Life expectancy for Aboriginal men is approximately 8 years less than for non-Aboriginal men. For women, the gap is approximately 7 years. The rates of preventable and treatable conditions such as diabetes, rheumatic heart disease, and kidney failure are dramatically higher in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities than in the general population. Reports documenting systemic failures in the provision of healthcare to Aboriginal Australians in remote areas have been produced decade after decade, with similar findings each time. Fact number 91. Australia was one of the first countries in the world to give women the right to vote and to stand for Parliament, with the Commonwealth Franchise Act of 1902 extending these rights, but there was a significant exception written into the law. Aboriginal women, and for that matter, Aboriginal men, were specifically excluded from the franchise. The Act extended voting rights to women while simultaneously specifying that no Aboriginal native of Australia, Africa, Asia, or the Pacific Islands, with the exception of New Zealand, was entitled to vote. Australia simultaneously pioneered women's suffrage and institutionalized racial exclusion in the same piece of legislation. The Paradox of 1902, in which Australia simultaneously became one of the world's pioneers of women's suffrage and simultaneously encoded racial exclusion into its federal electoral law, is one of the most revealing moments in Australian constitutional history. The contradiction was not accidental or unnoticed, it was deliberate. The architects of the Commonwealth were quite open about their intention to create a nation that was simultaneously progressive in its democratic institutions and explicitly racial in its definition of who belonged. Alfred Deakin, who became Australia's second Prime Minister and was considered one of the most enlightened figures of his generation, was also one of the strongest advocates of the White Australia policy and explicitly linked racial exclusion to democratic progress. His argument, which was widely shared, was that a functioning democracy required a population with sufficient cultural and racial homogeneity to share common interests and common values. The extension of democracy to women was compatible with this vision. The inclusion of Aboriginal Australians was not. This contradiction was not resolved until 1967 and is arguably still not fully resolved today. Fact number 92. The Kokoda Track Campaign of 1942 is one of the most grueling military operations in Australian history. Australian and Papuan forces held the Japanese advance along a 100-kilometre mountain track through the Owen Stanley Range in Papua New Guinea during some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. The conditions were extraordinary in their difficulty: rain that fell almost continuously, mud that could swallow a man to the waist, disease that killed as many men as bullets, and an enemy that was determined, experienced, and fighting with extraordinary ferocity. The Papuan infantry, known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, carried wounded Australian soldiers on stretchers for kilometre after kilometre through terrain that was barely passable on foot. The relationship between Australian soldiers and their Papuan allies was one of the more remarkable aspects of the campaign, and has been insufficiently recognised in official histories that tend to focus on the Australian soldiers to the exclusion of the Papuans, who were equally vital to the campaign's success. Fact number 93. The Canberra bushfires of January 2003 were an extraordinary event in that they directly struck the capital of Australia. 4 people died, 500 houses were burned, and the fires entered the suburbs of the city itself. The fires also burned through the Mount Stromlo Observatory, destroying telescopes and equipment that represented decades of scientific work. The observatory's director at the time, Brian Schmidt, who later won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work on the accelerating expansion of the universe, had many of his own research projects stored at the observatory. The fires demonstrated, in a peculiarly graphic way, that Australia's relationship with bushfire was not limited to remote rural areas, but was an integral part of life even in its major cities. Fact number 94. Australia has had serious concerns about the quality of its water supply in numerous instances that have not always received adequate public attention. Cryptosporidium contaminations of the Sydney water supply in 1998 caused the largest water health alert in Australian history, with more than 3 million people told to boil their water for several weeks. The contamination was later linked to a sewage treatment plant. The subsequent investigation found significant deficiencies in water testing and monitoring protocols across the city's water supply system. Fact number 95. The tainted blood scandal in Australia, involving the use of contaminated blood products that infected hundreds of Australians with hepatitis C and HIV in the 1970s and 1980s, was the subject of a royal commission that began in 2023, following similar inquiries in the United Kingdom. People who received blood transfusions or clotting factor products during this period, many of them children with haemophilia, were infected with diseases that were unknown and untreatable at the time, and in many cases the contamination continued even after the risks were recognized. Some of the affected individuals lived for decades without knowing why they were ill. Some died. The full extent of Australia's tainted blood scandal and the responsibility of governments, hospitals, and blood banks is still being determined by the ongoing inquiry. Fact number 96. The Emu Field and Maralinga nuclear tests conducted by the British in the 1950s and 1960s included not just the main bomb tests, but also a series of smaller experiments called the Vixen trials, which involved dispersing plutonium and other radioactive materials across the landscape without a full nuclear detonation. The purpose was to study how nuclear materials behaved in an accident scenario. The result was widespread contamination of a large area of the South Australian outback. But declassified documents show that some officials were more concerned about the embarrassment that would result from Aboriginal people being found at test sites than with the health consequences for those individuals. Fact number 97. The Australian government's response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s was, by international comparison, relatively enlightened, largely due to the influence of Health Minister Neil Blewett, who oversaw a national education campaign called the Grim Reaper Campaign that was notable for its bluntness and its willingness to address homosexual behaviour at a time when many other governments were still treating AIDS primarily as a moral, rather than a public health issue. Australia's early action in implementing needle and syringe programs for intravenous drug users, and over the objections of some conservatives, is widely credited with preventing a much larger epidemic among that population. But the AIDS epidemic still devastated the gay communities of Sydney and Melbourne in the late 1980s, killing hundreds of young men, and the survivors of that period carry the weight of that loss. Fact number 98. Australia's history of involvement in the Vietnam War is often overshadowed in the national consciousness by the Anzac tradition and the Second World War. Australia sent over 60,000 men and women to Vietnam. Between 1962 and 1975, 521 Australians were killed. The anti-war movement in Australia was significant and sustained. The commitment of national servicemen conscripts to a war in which Australians were dying generated enormous social and political tension. Veterans returned to a country that was deeply divided about the war, and were often received without the honours or recognition that their predecessors from earlier conflicts had received. The long-term physical and psychological effects of service in Vietnam, including exposure to Agent Orange, a defoliant that caused cancers and birth defects, were not adequately addressed by the government for many years. The experience of Australian Vietnam veterans returning from the war was in many cases deeply painful in ways that went beyond the physical and psychological effects of the war itself. Many veterans were advised by their commanding officers to change out of their uniforms before disembarking from troop ships or planes to avoid potential confrontations with anti-war protesters. The instruction was well-intentioned, but had the effect of making many veterans feel that their service was something to be ashamed of rather than acknowledged. What was not a myth was the absence of the kind of formal public recognition that veterans of earlier wars had received. There were no ticker tape parades for Vietnam veterans. There was no public ceremony of welcome. Many men dealt with the combination of combat trauma, exposure to Agent Orange, and social rejection by self-medicating with alcohol, a pattern that persisted through decades of inadequate support. It was not until 1987 that a welcome home parade was held in Sydney for Vietnam veterans, by which point many of the men who had served were in their late 30s and 40s, and some had already died. Fact number 99. The question of an Australian republic has been on the national political agenda since at least the 1990s, and was put to a referendum in 1999. The republic model on offer, which would have replaced the Queen as head of state with a president appointed by Parliament rather than directly elected by the people, was defeated. Significantly, polls consistently showed that a majority of Australians supported a republic in principle. But a coalition of committed monarchists and those who wanted a directly elected president rather than an appointed one was sufficient to defeat the specific model on offer. Australia remains a constitutional monarchy with the British monarch as its head of state. The debate continues and has intensified since the death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, with opinion polls showing increased support for a republic, particularly among younger Australians who have less personal connection to the monarchy. Fact number 100. The Coniston Massacre, revisited here in the context of the broader history of punitive expeditions across Australia, was not an aberration. It was the tail end of a pattern that had been operating for more than a century. In Queensland, the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and elsewhere, colonial governments had routinely organised or sanctioned punitive expeditions in response to attacks on settlers or their property. The expeditions almost always resulted in deaths among Aboriginal people, frequently far in excess of whatever had triggered them, and almost never resulted in legal consequences for the participants. The Coniston Massacre stands out in the historical record only because it was the last time such an expedition was carried out openly and without significant official embarrassment. It was the end of an era rather than a singular event. Fact number 101. Australia's story does not end with any single moment of reckoning or resolution. The history covered in these 101 facts is not a completed chapter. The dispossession of Aboriginal land is ongoing in the courts. The gap in health and life expectancy between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians has not closed. The trauma of the stolen generations reverberates through families who are still alive. The contamination at Maralinga is still in the earth. The children taken during the Stolen Generations policy have grandchildren and great-grandchildren who are living with what was done. Climate change is transforming the fire continent in ways that are already catastrophic and will become more so. The rivers are still overallocated, the species are still dying, but Australia also contains, within its history and within its present, an extraordinary capacity for confronting difficult truths. The 1967 referendum passed with 90% of the vote. The 1975 dismissal generated a democratic response so powerful, it eventually changed the political landscape. The response to Port Arthur showed that a society can act decisively against gun violence when the political will exists. The Franklin River was saved. Mabo was decided. The apology was delivered. 101 facts. One continent, a story that spans 65,000 years of human habitation, 2 centuries of extraordinary violence and transformation, and a present still grappling with the weight of everything that came before. From the first peoples who made this land their home for longer than history can easily comprehend, through the brutality of convict punishment, the terror of the frontier, the catastrophic wars and the disasters and the crimes and the political scandals, Australia's story is nothing if not confronting. but confronting the truth is always the first step towards something better. Thank you for watching and sleep well.